Okay, welcome everyone to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we are plunging into a really fascinating stack of sources. We're looking at a figure who just profoundly shaped the spiritual landscape of the West Paramahansa Yogananda.
That's right. And the source material we've been digging into is quite rich. We've got a collection of articles, some research notes, and one particularly central text called Yogananda, East Meets West. It really gives a comprehensive look.
It does, and our mission really for this deep dive is to unpack all of this material. We want to understand Yogananda's journey, the immense challenges he faced, and of course, the lasting impact of the man who's often called the father of yoga in the West.
And I think rightly so. We'll be exploring that unique blend he championed, Eastern wisdom meeting Western pragmatism.
Exactly. And as we get into these sources, you'll find they reveal some genuinely fascinating contradictions and surprising details, not just about Yogananda himself, but also about America at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, it paints a picture of the nation he arrived in, this sort of spiritual landscape waiting for someone like him, this unexpected messenger.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. Let's maybe start by setting the scene. What was the spiritual landscape like in the United States in the early 1900s, based on what these sources tell us?
Well, the sources depict America back then as a nation defined by really profound and unsettling contradictions. I mean, on one hand, you had this absolute boom of industrialism,
Right.
And a culture just captivated by scientific rationalism, huge material wealth, incredible innovation. Life was changing so fast.
Progress and prosperity seemed to be everywhere. But the sources suggest this wasn't necessarily translating into inner peace or fulfillment for everyone.
Not at all. That's the core contradiction. The material consistently points to this growing sense of spiritual emptiness alongside all that progress. It wasn't just a lack of faith, maybe, but more a feeling of disconnect.
Disconnect from what, exactly?
From traditional morality, for one. And also from that kind of boundless optimism that maybe characterized earlier American periods. Think about urbanization, the rise of technology, fantastic in many ways, of course.
Sure.
But the sources argue they were also, perhaps inadvertently, severing those deep personal roots of faith and community. The things that had sustained people for generations were being disrupted.
That makes a lot of sense. People moving from farms to cities, old ways being challenged by new scientific ideas.
Precisely. And this complex interplay, material progress fueled by science crashing against this sort of inner void, it created what the sources describe as a unique cultural vacuum.
A vacuum.
Yeah, or maybe a spiritual landscape in waiting. The existing structures, religious and otherwise, just weren't quite scratching that deeper itch for meaning, so the ground was almost uniquely primed for something different.
Okay, so where did traditional religion fit in? The sources talk quite a bit about Protestant Christianity, which was, the dominant force, but also, as you said, kind of in flux.
Oh, definitely in flux. It was facing major challenges. The sources offer a pretty strong critique, actually, of the form it often took back then. It was frequently characterized by what they call cold formal creedalism. Meaning a heavy emphasis on strict doctrine, very intellectual sermons, maybe theologically sound, but described as emotionally sterile, disconnected from what the sources term the heart's yearning.
So it became very head-focused, maybe lost some of that direct felt connection people craved.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And the result was pretty clear. The sources mentioned declining church attendance becoming more common and this kind of widespread disillusionment setting in. There's a line in there that says, wealth and rationalism were eclipsing piety. People felt maybe they were succeeding materially, thinking scientifically, but their inner lives felt, neglected, unaddressed by the main religious game in town.
But importantly, this spiritual dissatisfaction didn't mean people just stopped being spiritual, right? It just meant that hunger was maybe being redirected or wasn't being met by the existing options.
That's such a crucial point. The sources actually remind us about the historical memory of things like the Great Awakenings in American history.
Right, there's periods of intense religious revival.
Exactly. And those events had sort of embedded a preference in the American psyche for personal, emotional, and experiential religion, rather than just rigid institutions. People weren't necessarily craving more dogma. They craved, as the sources put it, a religion of the heart, something they could feel, something direct.
So you had this underlying hunger for direct experience simmering away beneath this surface of intellectual formality. And meanwhile, culturally, modernism was really starting to shake things up.
Oh, massively. Modernism basically grew out of rejecting a lot of 19th century values. The sources describe it as pushing for a radical reexamination of every aspect of existence.
How so?
The big emphasis was on finding new methods based on practical experimentation, on science, applying that scientific lens to everything: art, literature, philosophy, and, yes, even religion.
Okay, so on one hand, applying science to religion often led toward secularization, right? Questioning traditional beliefs.
Yes, and the sources point out this kind of dual effect. While it certainly challenged traditional faith for many, it also fostered an environment that was more open to exploring totally new ways of understanding consciousness and reality.
Interesting. So if you're already questioning the old ways and valuing experimentation, you might just be more receptive to completely new ideas, perhaps even ideas from outside your own culture, like Eastern mysticism.
And is that where we see the first stirrings of interest in Eastern thought starting to take hold?
It seems so. Now, it wasn't a mass movement by any stretch yet, but it was definitely present. You had groups like Theosophy already introducing concepts like karma and reincarnation into certain intellectual and artistic circles. A ripple of awareness.
Oh, okay.
And then you had influential thinkers like the psychologist William Chums, who was academically validating religious experience and mystic states. He was giving intellectual weight to personal spiritual exploration separate from institutions. So this created a small but maybe influential audience.
Exactly. A receptive audience, particularly among those who were maybe disillusioned with traditional church structures or just intellectually curious about these new frontiers of consciousness.
But of course, not everyone was open to this. There must have been pushback.
Oh, absolutely. A strong counterreaction. The sources also detail the rise of Christian fundamentalism, which was really gaining strength, partly in response to all these changes.
And they saw modernism and world religions as a threat.
A grave threat, according to the sources, something to be fought vigorously. For fundamentalists, these new ideas, along with things like modern biblical criticism, seem to undermine the literal truth of the Bible and the unique position of Christianity.
Wow. So putting it all together, it's an incredibly complex picture. You've got this deep spiritual hunger kind of pushed underground by formal religion.
Then you have scientific pragmatism demanding proof and practical results.
Modernism opening some doors to new ideas, but also fueling secularism.
And a powerful fundamentalist backlash resisting it all.
It really was, as the sources say, a perfect storm of spiritual hunger, scientific outlook, and religious anxiety.
It was. And understanding this complex backdrop, this landscape, is just crucial because it helps us appreciate why, when Yogananda arrived with his specific message, a message framed as verifiable scientific experiential religion that aimed to synthesize East and West the ground, was in some ways uniquely primed for it.
But also incredibly resistant in other ways.
Exactly. It wasn't a blank slate at all. It was a landscape already deeply shaped by both intense yearning and fierce resistance.
That context really highlights the scale of the challenge he walked into. Okay, let's pivot now from the American landscape to the messenger himself, Paramahansa Yogananda. The sources emphasize right away that his journey wasn't about personal ambition, was it? It was framed as a divine commission.
Yes, absolutely. His path, as the sources lay it out, seemed almost mapped out from infancy, maybe even before. He was born Mukunda Lal Ghosh on January 5th, 1893 in Gorakhpur, India. And his family wasn't just devout, they were deeply connected to the highest spiritual traditions.
And that connection is key, because his parents were direct disciples of Lahiri Mahasaya.
Exactly. The great master who the sources credit with reviving the ancient science of Kriya Yoga for the modern age.
And didn't Lahiri Mahasaya make a prophecy about the infant Mukunda?
He did. It's a powerful story in the sources. His mother took the baby to the guru for a blessing, and Lahiri Mahasaya held him and declared, clear as day, "Little mother, thy son will be a yogi. As a spiritual engine, he will carry many souls to God's kingdom."
Wow. So his destiny essentially declared by a renowned master before he could even talk. That really frames his mission from the outset, doesn't it? Not his choice, but a calling.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And the sources suggest his own innate spiritual nature was obvious very early on. He later spoke of having clear recollections of a past life as a yogi, even as an infant.
Really?
Yeah, he described his infant mind as a ferment of words in many languages. The interpretation in the sources is that this points to a soul already awake, carrying wisdom from past lives, not starting fresh.
That's fascinating. This idea of an ancient consciousness already present. And this inherent longing for God, for spiritual truth, led him on a pretty intense search for his own guru, right?
A very ardent search. He sought out many saints and sages in his youth. But that search culminated in 1910 when, at just 17, he met Swami Sri Yukteswar Giri. That meeting was the turning point.
And this began a period of intense training under Sri Yukteswar. The sources describe it as nearly a decade of strict but loving spiritual discipline.
It certainly wasn't easy by the sounds of it. Sri Yukteswar was known as a stern master, the Lion of Bengal. But that discipline was designed very specifically to forge Mukunda's character, purify his consciousness, and prepare him for the massive task ahead.
And Sri Yukteswar told him about this task.
Right from the beginning, apparently. He made it clear that Mukunda had been chosen by the great masters of their lineage, Babaji, Lahiri Mahasaya himself, to disseminate Kriya Yoga, specifically in America and then around the globe.
So again, it wasn't just an idea he had, but a destiny he was being actively prepared for. And that preparation wasn't purely spiritual, was it? There was an academic side, too.
That's right. Sri Yukteswar was very practical. He made sure Mukunda got a Western-style education, credentials that would hold weight in the West. So Mukunda graduated from Calcutta University in 1915.
Okay.
Then, after completing both his academic and his deep spiritual training, he took his formal vows as a monk, entering the ancient Swami order. That's when he received the name Yogananda, bliss, Ananda through divine union, yoga.
The sources also bring up this interesting concept relating to his preparation, this idea of him being a spiritual warrior.
Yeah, it's intriguing. The material mentions he apparently spoke of a past incarnation as William the Conqueror.
Which sounds a bit jarring for a yogi, perhaps.
It might, initially. But disciples definitely observed in him what they called an innate gift for leadership and this indomitable spirit of conquest.
But the sources interpret this not as worldly ego, but as representing the huge spiritual will he would need.
Exactly. For the mission he was given in the West, that kind of spiritual steeliness was apparently essential. He wasn't just going to teach some classes. He was tasked with establishing a beachhead for this ancient science. It was framed as a spiritual conquest, not over people, but against these deeply entrenched forces of materialism, rigid dogma, and, significantly, racial prejudice that were so strong in America then.
So that required a certain kind of strength, a resolve.
An immense strength. Perhaps that warrior archetype resonated with the kind of spiritual will needed for such a daunting task.
Okay, so he had the prophecy, the intense training, the direct commission from his guru, this development of spiritual willpower. What was the final push, the final confirmation that sent him on his way in 1920?
The sources describe it as a moment of just profound, undeniable divine confirmation. He was meditating at his school for boys in Ranchi, India, and he had this incredibly powerful vision.
A vision.
Yes. He saw the faces of a multitude of Americans pass before his mind's eye. It was an unmistakable intimation, a clear divine signal that the time had finally come. Go west.
And then, almost immediately after this inner vision, something happened externally to confirm it.
Like perfect synchronicity. The very next day, according to the accounts, the mail arrived, and in it was an invitation asking him to serve as India's delegate to the International Congress of Religious Liberals, happening soon, in Boston.
Boston, America. Wow.
Yeah, it was just too perfect to be a coincidence, the external invitation landing right after the internal command.
But even then, there was one final, even higher sanction that he sought or received before leaving India.
Yes. The ultimate green light, you could say. Mahavatar Babaji himself, the legendary deathless guru of their Kriya Yoga lineage, the one who revived the science, appeared to Yogananda.
Babaji appeared.
So the sources recount. And Babaji gave him the final, highest commission directly. The quote is, "Follow the behest of your guru and go to America. Fear not, you shall be protected. "You are the one I have chosen to spread the message of Kriya Yoga in the West."
That must have just cemented everything. No room for doubt after that.
Absolutely. With that ultimate blessing, that direct command from the source of the lineage, he set sail, headed for the unknown shores of America, not just as an immigrant looking for opportunity, but truly as a messenger, carrying this ancient promise, this spiritual science, to a land that was, in its own complex way, hungering for it.
So this whole backstory, the prophecies, the tough training, the divine visions and commissions, building that inner strength, it really frames his entire journey as presented in these sources, not just as his personal quest, but as this predestined, divinely guided mission, a mission with huge implications.
It does, which, when you think about it, makes the incredible challenges he faced upon arrival even more dramatic, and the story of how he navigated them even more compelling.
Let's get into that arrival then. The sources note his ship, the City of Sparta, docked in Boston September 19, 1920. And just a few weeks later, he gives that first major speech at the Congress.
Yes, October 6, 1920, the International Congress of Religious Liberals. His talk was titled The Science of Religion, and the sources call this a masterstroke of spiritual diplomacy.
Why diplomacy? What was so strategic about that approach, given the American landscape we just talked about?
Well, crucially, he didn't show up presenting Hinduism as some competing creed, asking people to convert or abandon their own faith. Instead, he offered this universal framework for understanding religion itself. And he framed it in a way designed to appeal directly to that pragmatic, even science-minded Westerner.
How did he do that?
He started not with complex Indian philosophy or unfamiliar deities, but with a universal human experience, the problem of suffering.
Okay, something everyone could connect with, regardless of background.
Exactly. He argued that the fundamental purpose of any true religion is ultimately to find a way out of suffering. And the solution, realizing one's true nature, which he described using terms like bliss or God.
Then here's where the revolutionary part came in for that audience.
Right. He proposed that achieving this ultimate goal wasn't just about blind faith or following dogma handed down through centuries. He suggested it could be based on a verifiable scientific methodology.
And that methodology, that science, was yoga.
Precisely. He famously stated, "Yoga is that science." He then drew a distinction between the intellect, which he said gives you only an outside view of reality and intuition,
Which he defined
as the direct grasp of truth, the faculty within us through which we can directly perceive and experience God consciousness.
And he didn't just talk about intuition, he offered practical ways to develop it.
Absolutely key. He told the audience that ancient techniques, specifically Kriya Yoga, existed as practical methods for awakening this dormant intuition, and for consciously controlling the life force, or prana, which he taught was the essential key to unlocking higher states of awareness and ultimately realizing God.
So it was very practical, results-oriented, a kind of science of the soul.
Exactly. And that really resonated, the sources suggest, with the American spirit that valued empirical evidence, practical application, things that worked.
How was this first major speech received?
According to the sources, it got immediate and enthusiastic acclaim. The Congress secretary praised his fluent English and a forceful delivery, and specifically noted the profound philosophy he presented. So that first seed, that universal message framed scientifically, was successfully planted among a key group of relatively open-minded religious liberals.
But despite that positive start, the sources make it incredibly clear his path forward was anything but smooth. He was truly, as the saying goes, a stranger in a strange land, facing huge challenges.
Oh, that's putting it mildly. America in the 1920s, as the sources detail repeatedly, was just rife with prejudice. As a man from India with darker skin, even wearing spiritual robes, he was immediately an object of intense curiosity and suspicion.
And the sources go into specifics about the kind of intolerance he faced, showing just how pervasive it was back then.
They do. He was apparently often ridiculed in public just for his appearance, his robes, his long hair. Even worse, in the segregated South, he was sometimes mistaken for an African American.
Which meant
he faced, as the sources put it, the full force of America's deeply ingrained racial intolerance. You have to remember the context. The KKK was having a major resurgence then. Horrible laws like the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 were being passed. He was navigating a landscape just thick with systemic racism, ethnic stereotyping, and religious bigotry, aimed at anyone considered different.
And it wasn't just social awkwardness or stares. There were actual institutional attacks, too.
Definitely. Religious fundamentalists saw him as a genuine threat, a purveyor of heathenism leading Christian souls astray. The sources talk about a sensationalist press often targeting him, spreading rumors, questioning his motives, his morals, trying to discredit him, and his growing influence.
And this opposition even escalated to physical danger at times.
It did. It reached a really dangerous point during a lecture series in Miami, Florida. The sources describe a situation where his life was actually threatened by an angry mob. Yes. The police chief apparently felt compelled to shut down his events just to ensure his safety. It was so traumatic for him that Yogananda himself later referred to that experience as my crucifixion.
Wow.
And beyond the mobs and the press, the sources confirm he was actually under government surveillance. He was on a watch list from 1926 to 1937, observed by the FBI and even British authorities.
God, what are they worried about?
They seemed concerned about his potential influence on the Indian independence movement back home. Maybe they thought his large spiritual gatherings were some kind of cover for political organizing.
Good grief.
Yeah.
So, facing mobs, government surveillance, constant racial prejudice, attacks from the press and fundamentalists. How on earth did he overcome all that and actually manage to build a significant following? The sources suggest it wasn't mainly by arguing back.
No, not primarily through debate. The sources emphasize again and again that he overcame these huge obstacles largely through the sheer power of his spiritual presence.
How so?
There are numerous first-hand accounts from people who met him, even initially skeptical people. They describe this radiant love, this profound sense of calm, and a palpable spiritual authority emanating from him that just seemed to disarm negativity and prejudice on the spot.
So while his message was intellectually engaging, it was his actual being, his presence, that really convinced people.
That seems to be the core finding in the sources, but he also employed a very clear, very intelligent strategy to establish legitimacy and build bridges, especially to the Western way of thinking.
What did that strategy involve?
Well, as you mentioned, he consciously used the language of science to frame his teachings, appealing to that American pragmatism. Very early on, in 1920 in Boston, he legally incorporated the Self-Realization Fellowship as a nonprofit organization.
Giving it a proper structure.
Exactly, a stable, recognizable Western structure right from the get-go. And crucially, he consistently drew extensive parallels between his own yogic teachings and the teachings of Jesus Christ. He showed deep respect for Christianity, which made this ancient wisdom feel more familiar, less threatening, to an audience largely raised on the Gospels.
So each step seems like a very deliberate, strategic move to counter prejudice and build trust.
Absolutely. A deliberate and intelligent move at each stage, the sources suggest. And then, starting around 1924, he launched his major public outreach effort, the famous spiritual campaigns.
Right. These were those huge cross-country lecture tours hitting major cities.
Yeah, and the response was described as just phenomenal and unprecedented. He wasn't talking to little groups in church basements. He was filling the largest auditoriums in the country to capacity Carnegie Hall in New York, the LA Philharmonic Auditorium.
Wow.
The sources mention accounts of thousands being turned away at the doors because there simply wasn't room.
So he went pretty quickly from being this relative unknown facing suspicion to becoming a major public figure.
Absolutely. He rose to prominence fast and was eventually dubbed the 20th century's first superstar guru. And why did the message resonate so strongly? Because it directly addressed that spiritual hunger we talked about earlier. He offered a path to self-realization, practical techniques for healing body, mind, soul through meditation. He offered meaning beyond just materialism or rigid dogma.
And this growing success led to a really pivotal move geographically, didn't it?
Yes. In 1925, he established the International Headquarters for Self-Realization Fellowship, or SRF, at Mount Washington in Los Angeles.
And that became the core center.
It became the mother center for his worldwide work. And the sources note how incredibly prescient this move was. He landed right in a region that was quickly becoming a kind of global epicenter for new and alternative forms of spirituality. LA was attracting creative minds, seekers, people open to new ideas.
And other key centers followed, too, like the beautiful Hermitage down in Encinitas.
That's right, a stunning property overlooking the Pacific, gifted to him by a devoted disciple, James J. Lin, who later became known as Rajarsi Janakananda. Yogananda spent significant periods there in deep spiritual work. It's where he completed writing his major book, Autobiography of a Yogi. Essentially, through these centers, he was laying down a permanent foundation for this bridge between East and West.
When you look back at everything he faced, the intense racism, the institutional attacks, the physical threats, it's really clear his ability to navigate all that wasn't just about survival. It was about thriving, using this blend of smart strategy and, as the sources consistently emphasize, that profound spiritual presence. That combination seems absolutely key to his success in the West.
He met incredible darkness with an equally incredible light, and remarkably, it worked.
Let's really dig into the teachings themselves now, because the sources make it clear his success wasn't just about charisma or personal magnetism, powerful as that was. It was also about the enduring power of what he actually taught, and crucially, how he taught it.
Yeah, his true genius, according to the material we looked at, really seems to lie in this uncanny ability he had. He could take these profound, ancient, sometimes complex Eastern concepts and translate them into language that was not only understandable, but deeply resonant for the Western mind.
His approach wasn't about conversion, was it?
No, not at all. He didn't come saying, you must abandon your Christian faith and become a Hindu. His whole approach was much more like, let's deepen the faith you already have. He presented what he called a universal path that aimed to reveal the underlying unity of all true religions.
So he wasn't trying to build a new religion, but more like uncover the common essence within existing ones.
Exactly. And his own life, in so many ways, became a kind of living synthesis, embodying this idea. A synthesis of Christ and Krishna, of science and spirituality, of East and West. He showed through his being that these seemingly different paths could absolutely lead to the same ultimate reality.
And one of his central aims, the sources state this very explicitly, was to reveal the complete harmony and basic oneness of original Christianity and original yoga.
Right. And the sources are careful to stress this wasn't just some superficial comparison finding a few surface similarities. No, it was presented as a profound reinterpretation of the Gospels through the lens of yogic science.
He even wrote extensively on this, didn't he?
He did. His major 2-volume commentary, The Second Coming of Christ, is entirely dedicated to this. In it, he meticulously tries to unveil what he termed the hidden yoga of the Gospels.
Hidden yoga. What exactly did he mean by that?
His teaching was that Jesus, just like the great sages of India, knew and actually taught a universal science of God realization to his closest disciples. He believed the Gospels contain these teachings, but they often get obscured by translation issues, by cultural context shifts over centuries, or by later institutional interpretations focusing more on dogma.
So he saw yogic principles underlying Jesus' words and actions.
Precisely. For example, Jesus' statement, "The kingdom of God is within you." Yogananda interpreted that not just as a nice metaphor, but as a literal description of an inner state of consciousness, accessible through meditation. Or the miracles he suggested, they weren't necessarily supernatural breaks in natural law, but demonstrations of a master yogi's control over the universal life force, prana or chi, a control gained through specific yogic practices. Even the concept of the second coming got a radical reinterpretation.
Yes, he made a really key distinction there, didn't he? Between Jesus, the historical person, and Christ as a universal principle.
A vital distinction in his teachings. Christ consciousness, as he explained it, isn't Jesus the man. It's the omnipresent, infinite intelligence of God that exists within all of creation. It's the only begotten Son, not in a literal physical sense, but understood as the sole, perfect, pure reflection of God within the manifested universe.
So therefore, the true second coming wasn't about Jesus physically returning someday in the future.
No. According to Yogananda's interpretation, based firmly in the sources, the true second coming is an interpersonal experience. It's the awakening of this divine Christ consciousness within the devotee's own soul. And how does that happen? Through deep scientific meditation techniques like Kriya Yoga.
So Jesus' command to find the kingdom of God within you was seen as directly parallel to the yogic goal.
Exactly equivalent. The goal of achieving inner communion with the divine presence, what yogis call samadhi or self-realization.
That approach must have been genuinely revolutionary and maybe quite disarming for a Western audience deeply rooted in traditional Christian theology.
Absolutely. By consistently using these Christ-centered analogies and, importantly, showing what sources describe as deep, genuine reverence for Jesus, he managed to make these otherwise esoteric Eastern teachings feel accessible and non-threatening to people raised Christian.
He wasn't asking them to switch teams, so to speak.
Not at all. He was showing them how their own scriptures, seen through this yogic lens, contain these universal scientific truths about realizing God. He presented Kriya Yoga itself not as a new religion, but as a universal scientific technique. He even called it an airplane route to God. A faster method, perhaps, but one that could enhance and validate the core spiritual truths of any faith path.
He kept hammering that point. Yoga as the science of true religion.
Yes. A systematic method, a way to move beyond just belief or dogma or ritual towards direct personal experience of the divine. And that experience, he taught, is what ultimately unites all paths.
Now, beyond the fascinating intellectual content of his teachings, the sources really emphasized the importance of his personal embodiment of these principles. That seemed to be what truly captivated followers.
Oh, absolutely. Drawing on descriptions from his own autobiography and countless accounts from disciples who knew him well, the picture that emerges is of a master who was simultaneously divinely powerful and deeply human. His divine magnetism wasn't just poetic language. People described it as something palpable, almost physical.
There's that powerful quote in the sources from Swami Kriyananda, one of his close disciples, that really speaks to this.
Yes, it's very striking.
Yeah.
Kriyananda said something like, "I would look at him and never see ego in his eyes. I would see infinity." People reported feeling this profound sense of peace or love or inexplicable joy just by being physically near him, feeling that tangible spiritual energy.
And the sources recount some pretty incredible, specific examples of this divine power manifesting, don't they?
They do. There's that famous account from Theodore Beck in Boston. They were together during a fierce electrical storm. The power suddenly went out, plunging the room into total darkness. As Yogananda began praying intensely, Beck apparently saw the master's face literally dissolve into a shining light of extremely intense colors, which reportedly lit up the whole room just moments before the electricity miraculously came back on.
Wow. And there were accounts of healings, too.
Numerous accounts of seemingly instantaneous healings, yes. Things that defied conventional explanation.
But the sources also take pains to balance this description of profound spiritual power with his incredibly delightful and disarming sense of humor.
Oh, that's absolutely essential to understanding his appeal. He constantly showed that spirituality wasn't meant to be some grim, austere, long-faced affair. It was supposed to be a path of ever-new joy.
And the sources include some wonderful anecdotes that show his human side, his ability to use laughter.
They do. There's the story from the ship coming to America where some prankster apparently shaved off only half of Yogananda's beard while he was asleep, leaving him looking completely ridiculous for a while.
Oh, dear.
And then there's that classic story he used to tell about his friend back in India, this fella who thought he was semi-intuitive. The friend confidently announced he sensed his brother had just arrived at the door, only for the family's large farm bull to wander into the house out of the rain instead.
That's great.
Those stories just make him seem so relatable, don't they? They show that profound spirituality could absolutely coexist with lightness, with joy, with laughter. But this warmth and humor were always grounded in what felt like undeniable spiritual authority and unwavering integrity.
Like those stories of healing, which seem to demonstrate his power.
Yes, accounts like the one about the elderly woman in Seattle, apparently suffering from severe rheumatism for years. The sources say she literally walked away from him without her crutches after he prayed for her. These weren't presented as isolated flukes, but as demonstrations of the real power inherent in the yogic science he taught.
And his integrity comes through strongly too, especially when faced with temptation or hardship.
There's a key incident described in the sources. A wealthy business promoter apparently approached him, saw the huge crowds he was drawing, and saw dollar signs. He offered to basically commercialize Yogananda's teachings, promising to make him rolling in dollars.
And Yogananda's response?
Instant and unequivocal refusal. Even though his organization often struggled financially, especially in the early days, he apparently said flat out, "I will never use religion as a business." That commitment to principle clearly made a huge impression.
So it's this unique combination, isn't it? Profound divine love, relatable human humor, undeniable spiritual power, and absolute integrity. That's what created this incredible magnetic field around him. The sources strongly suggest he convinced thousands, not primarily through theological arguments, but through the direct experience people had of him and of the results they got when they actually practiced his techniques.
It really was this blend of a universal teaching perfectly suited to the time, combined with his powerful personal embodiment of that teaching. That's what allowed him to break through so many cultural and religious barriers and reach people at such a deep, transformative level. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk, radiating the very consciousness he taught.
Okay, but as with any truly significant figure, especially one challenging established norms so directly, the sources are clear that Yogananda's journey and his organization weren't without facing significant opposition and some real controversies. We need to look at that too for a balanced picture.
Absolutely, that's crucial. And what's particularly revealing, as the sources themselves suggest, is that the criticism he faced actually came from two distinct and opposing fronts, which in itself tells you something interesting about the unique space he occupied.
Okay, let's start with the Western criticism first.
Yeah.
What were the main accusations and where did they generally come from?
Well, a lot of the Western criticism, as the sources laid out, seems to have been fueled by that predictable mix of religious intolerance, racial anxiety, and general skepticism towards anything mystical or foreign.
So, specific accusations.
He was sometimes accused, especially by fundamentalist opponents or sensationalist media, of being a cult leader. And his organization, Self-Realization Fellowship, was occasionally labeled by some former followers or external critics as being cultish or overly dogmatic, perhaps demanding too much conformity or devotion.
Were there more practical or organizational criticisms mentioned as well?
Yes, the sources do acknowledge instances of legal issues, like lawsuits involving disgruntled former associates or disciples, and there were sometimes accusations related to financial mismanagement or authoritarian tendencies in how he or the organization handled certain situations or individuals.
Okay. And the skeptics.
Naturally, those inclined towards skepticism tended to dismiss the numerous accounts of miracles or extraordinary spiritual experiences surrounding him as mere sensationalism, or perhaps exaggeration, or even group hallucination, the usual explanations when faced with things outside the norm.
And then, sadly but perhaps predictably, there was the element of outright slander, often rooted in prejudice.
Absolutely. The sources are quite direct about this. Vicious rumors were circulated, particularly concerning his relationships with some of his female disciples. The sources explicitly link this to the prevailing racial and sexual anxieties of an era deeply opposed to the idea of a dark-skinned foreign man holding spiritual influence over white women. It seems likely these rumors were amplified, perhaps deliberately, to undermine his growing influence by playing on those deep-seated societal fears.
Right. So that covers the resistance from the Western side, fear of the foreign, the mystical, mixed with racial prejudice and organizational critiques. But paradoxically, he also faced criticism from back east, from India.
Yes, that's the other side of the coin. He faced opposition from some traditionalists in his native India.
What was their issue?
Their perspective, as presented in the sources, was essentially that his work in the West amounted to a dilution of Orthodox Hinduism. They felt he was perhaps simplifying things too much, packaging ancient truths specifically for Western consumption, maybe watering them down to make them more palatable.
Were there specific points they objected to?
Some felt he overemphasized Christianity by drawing so many parallels with Jesus' teachings. Others thought he adopted too much of a pacifist tone, perhaps, which they felt contradicted the more assertive warrior spirit found in texts like the Bhagavad Gita, where Lord Krishna famously encourages the warrior Arjuna to fulfill his duty and fight.
And Swami Kriyananda's account in the sources suggests this kind of perspective persisted even after Yogananda's death.
It does. Kriyananda describes visiting India some years after Yogananda had passed and being, frankly, appalled that some devotees there seemed to view Yogananda's monumental, world-bridging work as merely the work of another saint. They didn't seem to fully grasp its unique universal scope and world-changing importance, the idea that he was specifically commissioned to bridge East and West on a global scale.
So it's fascinating. He's getting criticized by Western purists for being too foreign, too Hindu, too mystical.
And simultaneously, he's getting criticized by Eastern purists for being too westernized, too accommodating to Christianity, maybe not orthodox enough.
And the sources actually suggest that this criticism from both sides is incredibly significant.
Yes, it's presented almost as perhaps the strongest evidence that he was succeeding in his central goal of synthesis.
How so? Explain that logic.
Well, the thinking is, if he had just been a conventional Hindu missionary trying to convert Westerners, only the West would likely have attacked him for being foreign. Conversely, if he had completely abandoned his Indian heritage and just taught some westernized philosophy, only the East might have dismissed him for betraying tradition.
Right.
But the fact that he drew fire from both directions suggests he wasn't operating comfortably within the established boundaries of either culture. He was forging this new, universal path right there in the challenging middle ground between East and West. So the attacks from both shores, the sources argue, were proof that he was standing firmly on the very bridge he had set out to build.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
Yeah.
He wasn't just teaching about unity. He was living in that controversial, unifying space, inevitably challenging entrenched views on both sides.
Exactly. So understanding the nature and the source of the criticisms he faced actually gives us crucial insight into his unique position and the truly pioneering, boundary-crossing nature of his work. He clearly wasn't aiming for easy acceptance from everyone. He was aiming for a synthesis that transcended those old divisions.
And ultimately, the sources show that despite the opposition, his impact was profound and lasting.
Undeniably. Which brings us nicely to his enduring legacy, what the sources beautifully term a legacy of light. His arrival in America, they argue, wasn't just another teacher passing through. It really was a watershed moment in the spiritual history of the 20th century.
32 years he spent working tirelessly in America.
And in that time, he didn't just introduce some interesting philosophical ideas. He planted a living spiritual tradition that has continued to grow and flourish worldwide ever since. The sources really position him as a primary catalyst for a genuine merger, a real fusion between the spiritual consciousness of the East and the pragmatic dynamism of the West.
And probably the most visible, tangible vehicle of that legacy is his incredible book, Autobiography of a Yogi.
Oh, without a doubt. First published in 1946, just a few years before he passed away in 52. Its impact has been simply monumental. It's frequently cited as one of the 100 most important spiritual books of the 20th century. And for countless people, literally millions worldwide, it has served as the primary gateway to Eastern spirituality.
It's amazing to see the sheer diversity of people it influenced, too, isn't it?
Yeah.
The sources mention everyone from cultural icons like George Harrison of the Beatles
To tech visionaries like Steve Jobs, who reportedly reread it every year.
What is it about that book that gives it such enduring power?
The sources really credit its profound authenticity. It wasn't written about a yogi by an outside scholar or journalist. It was written by a yogi from direct experience. That eyewitness quality gives it this immense credibility and depth. And that authenticity seems to allow it to just cut through cultural boundaries and speak directly to the soul of the reader, sparking curiosity, maybe opening minds, inspiring countless personal spiritual journeys.
And through that book, combined with his decades of tireless teaching, he really did earn that title, Father of Yoga in the West.
I think the sources make a strong case for it, while other respected figures, like Swami Vivekananda, had certainly visited before him and made a significant impact.
Right, Vivekananda at the Parliament of Religions in 1893.
Exactly. But the sources highlight that Yogananda was arguably the first prominent Indian master to dedicate his entire adult life specifically to establishing a permanent, self-sustaining, and widespread mission in America. He wasn't just a visitor passing through, he came to stay to build something lasting.
And crucially, he didn't just talk about the philosophy of yoga, he made the actual practice widely accessible.
That's the key difference, perhaps. He brought the practical techniques, meditation, Kriya Yoga, to hundreds of thousands of people directly through his mass lectures, his incredibly detailed writings and correspondence courses, and then through the establishment of SRF temples and centers across the country and eventually the world.
And his consistent emphasis was on yoga as that science of religion.
Yes, a systematic method for achieving direct, personal experience of God. That scientific, pragmatic framing, offering tangible results through dedicated practice, seems to have resonated deeply with that underlying pragmatic American spirit we discussed right at the beginning. It wasn't just about belief, it was about experimentation and experience.
And the sources even suggest his pioneering work laid some essential groundwork for much more recent wellness trends.
They do. They point out how his introduction of practical meditation techniques, framed as a science for achieving inner experience and well-being, directly paved the way for the huge modern mindfulness and wellness movements that are just everywhere today. He played a truly crucial role, the sources argue, in the globalization of yogic wisdom, figuring out how to successfully integrate these ancient practices into modern, often secular life in a way that maybe hadn't been achieved on such a scale before.
So the organization he founded, Self-Realization Fellowship, SRF, continues to carry this specific lineage forward today.
It does. From that single vision he brought from India, SRF has grown into a major global spiritual family. The sources mention more than 600 temples and centers in over 175 countries, all guided by the monastic order he established to preserve and disseminate the teachings. But his influence also permeates culture far beyond the formal organization.
How so?
His teachings, or at least the core ideas he popularized, have influenced fields like psychology, medicine, and certainly the whole burgeoning spiritual but not religious movement.
Right.
His framing of meditation and self-realization, not as exclusively religious practices, but as universal human capacities and a kind of scientific path to inner peace and well-being that has really seeped into the broader societal understanding. It affects how these practices are viewed and used in clinical settings, in academic research, and personal development programs everywhere.
Ultimately, then, his life itself stands as this living demonstration of the very synthesis he taught.
Absolutely. He genuinely seemed to live the truth that there was no inherent contradiction between Christ and Krishna, between the wisdom of the Bible and the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita, between science and spirituality. His goal, as the sources consistently reiterate, was never to create some new exclusive religion. It was always about revealing the one universal truth that underlies all authentic spiritual paths, showing how they all ultimately lead to the same divine summit.
And the outcome, the legacy, was the creation of a kind of spiritual language and a practical path that could genuinely transcend the old boundaries, nation, race, creed, offering a way to connect with the divine based on direct experience rather than dogma.
His legacy, therefore, is much more than just SRF as an organization or even the phenomenon of the autobiography. It represents a fundamental shift in how Eastern spiritual practices are understood, valued, and accessed in the West. A shift that continues to expand, to evolve, and to illuminate countless lives right up to the present day.
So there you have it, our deep dive into the remarkable life and enduring legacy of Paramahansa Yogananda. What a journey from that incredible prophecy at his birth and Mahavatar Babaji's direct commission.
Through his incredibly challenging navigation of the complex, often hostile American landscape, facing down fierce opposition,
to ultimately succeeding in establishing a truly global spiritual legacy, one rooted in universal truth and practical scientific technique.
And the core of his message, which comes through so powerfully in these sources, really remains a beacon for today, doesn't it? That potential for self-realization, for directly experiencing the divine, for finding God not as some distant judge, but as ever new joy that's not limited by our background, our culture, our beliefs. It's presented as a universal human capacity, just waiting to be awakened within each of us.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to maybe reflect on, building on everything we've discussed from the sources. Given the intense cultural resistance, the prejudice, the skepticism that Yogananda initially faced when he arrived, and yet contrasting that with the eventual really widespread acceptance and even integration of practices like yoga and meditation into mainstream Western culture that we see everywhere today. What does his extraordinary story tell you about the potential for deeply held spiritual beliefs and practices to actually transcend what seem like insurmountable cultural barriers, and perhaps even to help evolve entire societies towards greater openness, maybe greater understanding over time, something to consider?